Hey, what's up, everyone? It's just kind of weird, obviously, um, having to teach through a camera then instead of in person. But first of all, I hope everyone is doing okay and that they're you know and that, that everything's you're healthy, you're safe, that your family's doing well. And I know this is a really weird time and a weird and just a weird situation for everyone involved. And I just, we talked a little bit about it before all the craziness started, and we got, we got school got out and everything. But this is a really weird time. But I really hope everybody's doing well, and that this remote learning stuff is goes smoothly for everybody. It's going to be weird. It's going to be kind of awkward and weird at first, myself included. I've never had to do anything like this before, so but we'll get through it together. And hopefully that introductory video I sent out made sense and kind of how the units and weeks are going to work and everything. Um, but yeah, I'm going to try to keep each lesson at, about 15-ish, 20-ish minutes or so, hopefully. So let's just jump right in. So we're picking back up with operant conditioning, which is where we left off on that Friday before, obviously before school let out. We had just talked about positive or reinforcement and punishment, positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment. This is the second half of operant conditioning, which is about something called about how conditioning takes place with that, whether it's continuous, whether it's partial, whether it's every so often, or the same every time, or whatever. We're gonna get into that more here in just a minute. But yeah. So let me let me get into this. So Skinner, when he talked about operant conditioning, he talked about how, obviously punishment or reinforcement followed a response by the subject. And he used a lot of different ways to figure out if this punishment or reinforcement could be manipulated to change the learning or how well the learning stuck, or things like that. So he conducted a lot of different patterns or schedule with reinforcement. What I mean by that is that um, he would maybe only reinforce some of the time after the response that he wanted, or he would wait for a certain number of responses that he wanted before he reinforced, or sometimes he would do it after every single time. And he did this with different subjects to see how their learning changed during that type of reinforcement schedule. So and then obviously recorded his notes and put all that out there. And what he found was that the way that we reinforce, whether it's constant or only some of the time, has a profound effect on how well we learn something, both how quickly we learn it and also how well it sticks and how long it stays around in our behavior and our thinking. So we're going to talk about how those reinforcement schedules affect our learning. And there's four types, and I'll kind of go over how some examples of each of them and what they mean, and then also talk to you about how you can recognize it in like an AP problem or something like that. Um, so anyway, continue. There were a couple different ways that Skinner did this. He tried what was called continuous reinforcement, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you're reinforced every single time that you do what you're expected to do. So in other words, if I want my dog to, go fetch, a ball or whatever, and I give him a treat after every single time that he goes and gets the ball, then he's going to pick up pretty quickly that that's what he's supposed to do. So in other words, it's quick learning. But on the flip side of that, Skinner also found that it's also a quick drop off of extinguished learning. In other words, just almost like extinction, where you forget the response altogether. He found that it quickly went away as well if you stopped. So in other words, if I'd stopped giving my dog a treat after every single time, then eventually he would forget or just stop going to get the ball because he knows he's not going to get a treat anymore. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, or a catch-22, if you will, where continuous learning is good for picking up something very quickly, but it's also got the flip side and the downside of extinguishment pretty quickly as well. Shaping is when you are trying to teach a complex or a multi-step behavior by reinforcing along the way. So the best example I use of this is being a coach myself, being a baseball coach. Like obviously, if I'm teaching them how to hit a baseball, I'm not going to just tell them to hit a baseball. I have to teach them how to where their feet should stand and how their hands should be and where they should hold the bat and what they should try to do with it. So basically, I'm having to go through step by step and tell them what they're expected to do in order to be successful. So Skinner was said shaping was when as you see there, it's the reinforcing of behavior until the entire routine is displayed. Um, so you're shaping an entire behavior and not just a single action. And obviously this is done a lot of times with animals, like where if you have a dog that is much smarter than my dog, who can when you come up and say okay, sit, lay down, roll over, like obviously you don't do all three of those. You don't teach all three of those in one setting. It's got to be you got to teach them to sit first and then reward for that, and then teach them to lay down and then reward for that, and then roll over. So you're shaping an entire behavior through reinforcement, not just one single action. Um, you have to go through step by step in order to get to that point. That's another example of a reinforcement schedule. But the main thing we're going to talk about in this set of notes is what's called intermittent reinforcement, which is other word. You could also substitute the word partial there for intermittent, so partial reinforcement. And this is when you get rewarded some, but not all of the time. So in other words, you only get reinforced for some correct responses, not every single correct response or expected response or whatever. And the reason that partial reinforcement is in Skinner's eyes, and pretty much most people who are trainers or or anything like that who use reinforcement on a regular basis also say that partial reinforcement is better than continuous reinforcement, and it's because the responses are very resistant to extinction. In other words, they don't go away as quickly. It may take a little bit longer to learn, and it may take a little bit longer to stick in the mind for learning and with thinking and behavior, but it's also not going to go away as quickly either. So they're very resistant to extinction in that way, but they're also it takes a little bit longer to learn them as well. And then also, Skinner came up with four different partial reinforcement patterns um, that all have a very different effect on our learning and drop off of learning if they're not reinforced. So we'll get into that. And I'll talk at the end about how you can recognize each one on like a question or, a free response or prompt or anything like that. So there are two types he used, and then two types of each type, if that makes sense. So kind of like positive and negative punishment. There's punishment and reinforcement, but then also positive and negative. So with the ratio schedules, or with reinforcement schedules, there's two types. There's ratio and then there's interval. Ratio schedules are based on the number of responses that a subject gives. And then reinforcement is given based on those numbers of correct responses or expected responses. So a fixed ratio schedule is one where after a set number of responses is shown, then someone is reinforced. So in other words, once whatever the predetermined number is, once that number is carried out, once that number of responses is done, then they get reinforced. An example of this, as you see on the slide, would be like if I'm a salesman, which I'd be a terrible salesman. I think you all know that. But if I was a salesman and I got a bonus after every it says there are 5 things that I sell, I get like a bonus on my paycheck. That is an example of a fixed ratio because it's a fixed number, 5, and it's a number of responses ratio. And so every 5 units or products that I sell, I get a bonus. It's reinforcing the desired behavior of me selling as many products as possible. And what Skinner found, the effects that had on learning was that you you had a high response rate, which meant that you tended to um, do what you were expected to do pretty regularly, but after you reached that reinforcement point, it kind of dropped off. So in other words, like once you got reinforced, you may not have acted exactly the same way that you did to get reinforced until you get closer to that reinforcement number again. Um, some other examples that of fixed ratio, probably the most obvious example of it is a punch card at a restaurant. I know not a lot of restaurants are open right now, but back before all this craziness happened, like there's a ice cream place next near where I live, and they have these little punch cards, and you get after every 10 ice cream cones, you get like a free one. So it's like, every 10 times I buy an ice cream cone or a milkshake or whatever, I get a free treat. That's the example of fixed ratio, set number. After that set number is reached, I get reinforced. Um, and then a school example of this would be smart lunch credit. Okay, so every 4 smart lunches you go to, set number, you get reinforced through some kind of reward, whether that's a increase in your grade or a higher grade or whatever. That's again trying to get you to perform the behavior they want, which is coming to a smart lunch. And it's a set number 4, and then you get reinforced through that. Um, the other type of ratio schedule is called a variable ratio. Variable, you can just substitute the word in random for that. And then this is just when you get reinforced after a random number of responses. So it's not set in any way. The best example of this would be gambling or like slot machines. Like you don't know when the reinforcement is going to happen of winning or whatever, but you continue to carry out the behavior, until you get reinforced usually, and then but it could be the next time you play, or it could be, 10 times down the line. You never know. Um, Another example of this would be door-to-door salesmen. If they don't, there's not a ton of door-to-door salesmen out there anymore, but like, people who used to go door-to-door to sell products, the next house they would go to might buy something, or it might be they might have to go to the entire next neighborhood before they get a sale. But they get reinforced through that sale. So it's just a random number. So it's variable ratio, a random number of responses. Skinner found that this also produced a very high rate of response. In other words, people would perform the behavior they wanted, but also it was very resistant, excuse me, to extinction, because you didn't know when that next drop off, or that you didn't know when that next reinforcement was going to take place. So you kept the action going, which whereas with a fixed ratio, after 5 or 10 or whatever that you're going to get reinforced, so you don't really start really carrying out the behavior you're expected until you get closer to that reinforcement point. So that's the difference between the two. So again, ratio schedules are based on the number of responses, and then then the interval schedules, these are based on time periods or amounts of time. So anytime you see like an interval, that's an amount of time. It could be minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, whatever. But fixed intervals are exactly what it sounds like. You get reinforced after a fixed or a set interval, which is a set amount of time or a fixed amount of time. The best, probably most obvious example of this in our lives, or at least in my life, is getting paid for my job. I get paid monthly. Teachers do. My wife gets paid every 2 weeks, but it's a set number, and we get reinforced, which in this case would be our salary, after that set amount of time, whether it's a month or whether it's 2 weeks or whatever. We get reinforced after a fixed amount of time, a fixed interval. Another example of this would be like going to the dentist. You go to the dentist every 6 months to get your teeth checked out and cleaned or whatever. So that's another example. Or a yearly physical. Every year you go get a physical. Um, School example would be your final exams at the end. Every semester you have a final exam, or every quarter you have an exam, whether it's a midterm or a final or whatever. Like that's a set amount of time. You get reinforced through that test or that assessment. Skinner found that these are typically moderate responses. In other words, intervals weren't as good as ratios for how quickly someone learned and how well they carried out that action, um, up until the reinforcement point. So, for example, I always use the example in class, like if you've ever been in a class where that you have like a quiz every Friday. What that means is that you're probably not going to study much Monday through Wednesday. You may study a little bit, you may study here and there, but like you're really, really going to study Thursday night, which is because you know the quiz is the next day. So there's a flurry of activity towards the end of the interval because you know you're getting reinforced with that quiz on Friday. So you're only going to study as it gets closer to that point, or you're only going to um, brush your teeth a lot really close to that dental exam or whatever. So that's the downside to fixed interval schedules. And then the other type of interval schedule is a variable or a random interval schedule, and that's, like I said earlier, it's random. This is the best example of this: pop quizzes. You don't know when a pop quiz is going to happen if you're ever in a class with that. The reinforcement is to get you to study, and because you don't know that that pop quiz could occur, it could occur at any moment. Hopefully, the behavior is being reinforced is to study or read every single night, just in case that pop quiz takes place. Um, from a teacher standpoint, my example would be, it's kind of funny for you guys as students, but when I get observed by administration, I don't know. Sometimes I know when that's going to happen, but a lot of times I don't. So, I may not really do what is the picture perfect way of teaching, every single time, but then once that admin shows up, I try to, act like I quote unquote should. So that there's that. That's just an example from my life, but low and steady response rates is what Skinner found, as you can see there at the bottom. Um, so anyway, let me go and show you this chart right here. I'm almost done. Hopefully, I'm under my time here. But what each of these lines is trying to show, excuse me, is kind of how our behavior acts during these intervals. Each of these little like marks is meant to be when reinforcement occurs. So you can see the variable ones, the ones with the V's, are a pretty steady line. And what that means is that because the reinforcement is not happening at a set amount or a set number, we tend to have pretty steady behaviors. So because we don't know when the reinforcement is going to occur. Um, on the flip side of that, with the fixed ones, as you can see where the F's are, um, the the responses are kind of flat until it gets close to that reinforcement point. So, a fixed interval, like I was saying with the quizzes on Fridays, this would be like, if you look at the number of responses, which right over here, like this would be like Monday through Wednesday in terms of your study, and then all of a sudden an increase in your studying Thursday night before this quiz, which would be here on a Friday. Same thing here with the fixed ratio, which would be back to the bonus after 5 units sold or whatever that I talked about. Uh, let me just use the ice cream card I was talking about. So like what this would mean was that if it's after every 5 or 10 ice cream visits, then what this is saying here is that I might not want to go to the ice cream store because I know I've got to, or the ice cream place, because I know that there's not I'm not going to get reinforced. Sorry. I'm not going to get reinforced because I'm not close to that number yet. But then as I get to like 7, 8, 9 punches on the card, my activity is going to go up about going to get ice cream because I know I'm getting to get reinforced at that point. So that's what all this chart means. Obviously, feel free to ask questions if it doesn't make sense. But what this is meant to show is that the variable schedules, which are the random ones, produce a more steady response rate, a more steady behavior rate, and then the fixed schedules tend to produce kind of a drop off in learning until it gets close to that reinforcement point, which you know what it is, whether it's numbers or time. So anyway, and then the last slide is just something that's thrown in here called the Premack principle, and all this says is that what Skinner found and has kind of been expanded upon by guys like David Premack is basically all it says is that you know if we are given an opportunity to get something that we desire, we prefer, then that desire to have those preferred behaviors or rewards or whatever would convince us to maybe do something less desirable. So, for example, as it says there, video games and studying. What I mean by that is like if you know that if you study for an hour, you get 30 minutes or an hour of video games or whatever, if that's your thing, you're going to be more likely to do that if you know the video games are following. And then, like, ice cream and vegetables. If you know you're getting an ice cream cone at the end of your meal, if you eat all your vegetables, then you're probably going to be more likely to eat your vegetables if you're a fan of ice cream and you're not like lactose intolerant or anything. But that's an example of that. Um, I always use the example of if I know I'm getting a really good steak dinner for doing something around the house or or whatever, some chore, then I'm gonna be more likely to do that because I love steak. I love all food, but you know that. So anyway, I think that's it. Yeah, that's it for this one. These PowerPoints are going to be posted to the website and to Google Classroom, along with the remote learning guides that I went over in the introductory video. But obviously, reach out if you have any questions. Um, and I'll see you guys. I'll see you guys next time for social learning, observational learning. Take care, guys. See you soon.